I honestly don't really know what to call this episode.
Okay.
But I think that listeners will get value out of it because a couple of reasons. One, I think they'll learn what can be said back and forth between shaper and surfer.
Uh-huh.
What they could potentially have in terms of the feedback loop, because this is the first time I've ever done something like this with any shaper.
Okay.
And I've been getting boards from Custom for a while.
Right.
But I've never done, try this board, okay, give me feedback. Okay, here's a new board.
Right.
Give me feedback. Okay, here's another one. Give me feedback. I've never done that before, and I think it was a really cool journey. So I think sharing that, letting them know, and then kind of what our ultimate conclusions were.
Right.
Were kind of neat.
For now, right? Yeah.
Do you remember how it all got started?
I mean, this got started pretty much exactly a year ago when we were surfing.
Yeah.
We were surfing, and you said, "Oh, I kind of want you to make me a board." And I said, "What do you need?" And you said, "I don't know. What do you like currently?" And so I was very much into this twin.
Yeah.
Which I had made for myself just now, and that's the third version I'm making for myself. So I just gave you that to say, how would you like a 6/8 twin?
Yeah.
I'll make you one. Take this, and we'll make one for you. And that's how it started.
And that was the one you remember, the surf meetup we had at Ocean Beach, like the really big day. Was that the same board?
That's the same board. Yeah.
And that was was that before or after that was the conversation?
It was like before we went out in the lot, you said, I want to get a board from you. And then we surfed, and then you didn't have a specific thing in mind. You just said, make me something. What do you like?
I do remember you asking, though, you said, "What do you have a hole in your quiver somewhere?" And I was like, yeah, like something like that.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, it's like a twin mid-length. And really, the other side of it, I thought, was I had Nick Franco at Shearwater build me that 7.0. Uh-huh. And that was for bigger OB, funkier, wonky OB, but that knee high to a couple feet overhead, it was almost a gap. And I had high performance boards and I had bigger boards, but I didn't have that gap. Right. And so the board was really for the gap, because a lot of times I was going out with clients and in those kinds of conditions.
Right.
And I was like, oh, it'd be more funny to have something that was a mid-length but more maneuverable. Right. And you were like, what about this? And I was like, yeah.
Okay.
I don't have that in my quiver.
Right.
Yeah. So essentially, here's the funny thing about it. I think it's funny, but I have 3 notes in my phone. I have Z-Twin Testing, Z-Twin Testing 2, and Z-Twin Testing 3. And coincidentally, all 3 of them had 7 surfs.
Oh, that's fun.
So it's 21 total surfs between these, and it was even 7.
Okay.
And we didn't plan it out that way, but it just ended up being 7 surfs, 7. And I sent you notes. I'm curious because they're pretty detailed notes.
They are.
What was your impression when you first got the first notes? Were you like, whoa? Or were you like, oh, this is helpful?
No, what I appreciate about all that feedback is that it's detailed. It talks about what were the conditions that they were ridden in, how did the board feel, and how did the board feel on paddle in, takeoff, setting rail, turning, bottom turn, top turn. All that stuff I thought was super helpful and more detailed feedback than I've ever gotten from anyone. Right? And to me, that's just like so valuable, because I know what I feel when I ride my boards, and I can say, I don't like the rocker. I made it too flat. The next version, I'm going to change that. Yeah. But I haven't gotten that level of feedback from the surfers I've made boards for. Yeah. And you are a good enough surfer that you're confident in that feedback. So, for example, Bonnie, who I've made so many boards for, she's not as confident in sharing what she's experiencing, right? Because it's always the question, is it the board or is it me, right? And you're confident enough that you say, no, I know that I can surf, so now let's talk about the board, right? So that's gold, right? And it's so valuable. And I hope that I was then able to tweak, and we theorized on what we should change for the next one to get closer to what you want. So I do remember, even with this one, you already switched out fins.
Yeah, so it's funny because I'll go through some of the notes because immediately I said in my note on the very first session, I said, my goal changed after this session, mostly because of how responsive it was compared to what I thought it would be.
Right.
And so I had a new goal: steeper, faster waves, responsive and maneuverable. So we started rolling with that.
We did, and the funny thing is, I do remember you said, oh, I just kind of want a maneuverable mid-length.
Yeah.
But that is not a steeper, faster waves, right? But
right.
then you're like, oh, steeper, faster waves. And then I remember two things happened across the course of feedback. Is like, one, you did change out the fins and it made a huge difference.
Yeah.
And two, you immediately said, this board is too wide. This board is too wide for what I want.
We'll come back to that because I in my feedback, I should let people know I really tried my best not to tell you anything around make it thinner, make it narrower, make it this or that.
Right.
I tried my best, and it was really hard because subconsciously I'm like, I don't like boards more than 20 inches wide. Like
Right.
in my head, I don't know why,
Right.
but I don't like them, and I have a feeling like it's not going to work.
Right.
And you were like, really? And then you kept like challenging me, and it was good. But I did my best not to tell you those things. But on that one, I think I did mention it.
I mean, this is not a narrow board.
No,
This
it's
is
pretty
not.
wide.
It's pretty wide.
But to the point of good surfer, but moderate to progressing surfer.
Right.
You had Jessie surf this, and she shredded on it.
Right.
Right. And so she is, I would say, 20 times better of a surfer than me that could probably make anything work really nicely.
Right.
But I also think the other variable is that they're different waves. And I actually tried this one in Guiones.
Yeah.
And it worked all right. But I think the waves up here are different power band and different curvatures than Guiones. But yeah, the fins were the first one. So we went from keels, which I'll throw up an old photo that I sent you, to these ones.
The uprights.
The upright twins. And holy crap, that made a huge difference in just that yellow board.
In the original, right?
Yeah, in the original. So at first it was, a lot of the feedback was, if I'm going front side, toe side would be the right rail. Mm-hmm. As I'd pump up the wave, as I would come down and release, that left rail would catch.
Right.
And then it was hard to get on rail, but once it was on rail, it held.
Right.
And then it like shot out, which I liked, but it was like, if I could just get it to sink.
Right.
Right. And so then you were like, well, why don't you change fins? And I was like, well, okay, Zouhair, whatever. And it went from keel to these, and it was like a huge difference. Like the base was smaller.
Right.
It was much more upright.
Right.
I'll throw up the photo where we did the side by side, but it was like a pretty significant difference.
Right. Well, I was surprised how much difference you reported in feedback.
Yeah.
Because like, oh, it's going to make a small difference, but you were like, oh, this is totally different.
Yeah.
It's like, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and it was so funny because I was so excited about that. And I remember like people were at the beach were like, oh, it's a sick outline. I'm like, yeah, it's a sick outline. And then and then we changed it. Let's see here. Where was it? So all of the feedback was like tons of speed, had a hard time rolling on a rail, while still managing the speed. So speed was never an issue. And these were all, this was in January. The whole experiment started in January 2024. So the waves here are like chest to head high, head high to overhead. And then new fins, and felt fast and loose. Felt like I could roll rail to rail more on the smaller waves, few great turns. One roundhouse, still a little sticky.
But you were still catching the outside rail.
Let me see. No, it doesn't say that I was in this one. Yeah, it was just sticky rolling. That's what we're saying here. But maybe I just didn't experience it on that one again. So it was like I felt like the part where I could get it on rail, and then once I held it, the thing shot out. But then I couldn't get it back onto the other rail quick enough to then come around. And if I did, then the thing held all the way through.
Right.
And that's what I really wanted out of something like this in those kinds of waves. I wanted something that could draw a long line, but be maneuverable enough for me to make that quick transition as I come up the wave. But that was crazy, the difference. And it was, I always use the term didn't bite. Like it didn't bite. Once it did bite, then it held.
Right.
But it was like I'm like putting all my weight into it.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to lean over. I'm just trying to sink that rail and get it engaged, and it wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
It just wanted to like float.
Right.
That was it. And then so that I gave you that feedback.
Yeah. And so at that point already, we said like this is one of two things in my mind, right? So the first one was it's too wide. So why are you having a hard time rolling? It's like, that's the width. Let's make it narrow. Or it's too much concave. So it's so much lift that you have a hard time disengaging that. So those were the two things we said. But we said for the second version, let's just change one parameter, right?
Yeah.
And so we kept the concave and we made it narrower.
So the concave is between the two rails on the bottom of the board. It's the dome. It's the doming factor.
Exactly.
Right. So essentially.
Right. And so we kept the same numbers, but we made this second version narrower.
Yeah. And what was the? I want to put up the dims on that one.
Yeah.
So they're all 6'8".
They're all 6'8". This is 21 and a half.
Okay. Yeah, that was 21 and a half. That's 20 and an eighth, I think.
This is 20 and 1/8.
Yeah.
So that's significantly different.
Yeah. An inch and a quarter.
And so yeah, in terms of like it doesn't bite, like there's two things that I remember from these reports, from the very detailed notes that I so much appreciate. The first one is get it on rail, which is a different transition than going to the top and then going from inside rail to outside rail, right? Okay. So the first one being like,
on the bottom turn.
It's just like I'm paddling in, I'm dropping down, where the momentum is still very sort of planing surface, because you roll on rail at the end of that drop,
right?
And so now you're disengaging the full surface into the rail,
right?
And so if you have all this lift from the water rushing through, you need to like unstick that, right?
Yeah.
So is it the concave because like it's stickier, or is it the width of the board? And
the area in which I need
area,
to get
right? Like that you need to roll over.
And I have small feet relative to most people. I have like 8.5.
Okay.
So I think that's why I've always been like I like narrower boards. Like I like 18-inch boards. 19-inch boards. That's like my high performance boards.
Yeah.
So 21 and a half was like, holy cow, there's a longboard.
That's a longboard, yeah. So even 20 and an eighth is like still really wide for you.
At first, yeah. But again, I was trying to get over that mental hurdle where I was just going to give you feedback and let you make the adjustments because I'm not the shaper.
Plus, it's so hard to, especially in a really good sort of iterative process, it's just really good to change one thing, and instead of sticking to numbers, I mean, the number is a reference point of where we start, right? So if I take an inch and a half almost, right, off of the width, I mean, that's already a big step, right? It doesn't matter whether we went sub 20 or not. It just matters, okay, we made a change here. And so I do remember this felt better, but you were still getting stuck somewhere. Is that right?
Yeah. So going to the 2 version.
And it was still the drop in and put it on rail. That was still sticky.
Yeah. The pumping was so much smoother. The speed was maintained all the way through. It said I have here, it felt easier to roll. And this was in, so here was the deal. So this was waist to shoulder high was the first session on it.
Right, because
So anything
I made
less
this for
than
you in
shoulder
February, and so the waves also changed, right?
Yes, so this is in April.
Right.
So it's smaller waves now. All of the smaller waves felt loads better.
Right.
Like it didn't felt sticky. It rolled really easy. Speed got maintained. And then it was once it got bigger than shoulder high, that's when I was like, oh, it's back. And so it was like I couldn't sink the thing. It was almost like I was going too fast and it was floating too high on the water. I couldn't get that thing in.
Right.
And so
you did give me that feedback, and that's why for the third version we said, well, if it's still there, then it's too much lift, which means it's too much concave.
Right.
So let's remove concave. So there's still concave in version 3. It's just a lot less.
Less.
And then the concave is actually through the tail on these two.
Yeah.
And on this one, it's actually flat.
Through the tail.
Through the tail.
So concave in the middle.
Concave in the middle, and then it flattens out.
And this is flat to concave.
Flat, yeah, it's
Flat
like
to concave.
yeah. No, it's not flat. It's concave, and then
all
the way, but it gets less concave between the fins. But here, there's no concave between the fins.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So in version 2, I'll extend on that. I got a couple sessions in Guiones.
Yeah.
That was when we met up down there.
Right.
And again, the waves weren't that size zone that we were looking for. So yeah, that was in April. And then version 3 came out. And it started out, this was July. It started out small again. Small, and then October
came
and then
around.
December, just recently.
Right.
We finally got this one into that chest plus zone.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 and 3 felt pretty much exactly the same on all the small waves. Like I can't tell.
You can't tell the difference in small waves between 2 and 3, even though
one
has
I will
more
say,
concave and the other one has less.
I will say that just and again, we have limited reps. Right. So if I were to choose in small waves, if I just a blind taste test, I would choose 2 in small waves with these upright fins.
With these uprights?
Right.
Okay.
And I think mostly it had to do with for me, 2 felt zippier rail to rail than 3. 3 was it felt very close, but if I had to make a choice, it would have been 2 in small waves.
Right.
With these fins. And so when we got this in big waves, we're like, okay, we got to test it, right? So now we figured out the small waves.
Right.
Because I remember you even saying on number 2, we were out at Boathouse, and you and Bonnie were like talking about some turn I did on this one backside.
Yeah.
And it was this one, and I was like, yeah, that did feel good. And so I was like, I haven't had that feeling with this one on small waves. And it wasn't just that one session, but just in general.
In general.
You know, it's good. It's a good board, but it wasn't the same. And then once we got this in bigger waves, the stickiness was there again. I was like, damn it.
Which I was kind of bummed about, because I was
know.
okay, we took out the concave, and now you can just go sink that rail.
And to keep in mind too, the waves that I started surfing on this one were much bigger than that one.
Yeah.
So this was like, now I'm pushing it OB in December.
Right.
Where, you could probably call that a couple feet overhead, not just a little bit overhead.
Yeah.
And you're going so much faster.
Right.
So much faster. And it was one of those things that held like incredibly well. But it was always when I wanted to do that transition, or always when I wanted to set that rail at that perfect time, it would hesitate just a little bit. It would do it, but it was just that little bit like, oh, now I have to think about it. Right. Like, whereas you don't want to
have to think about it.
Yeah. So then I talked to Harry about it, Harry Knight.
Yeah.
Because and this was just a few weeks ago. I was like, Harry, it was Dave Rostovich's electric acid, and I sent him this photo, and I was like, how the hell does he get this thing on rail with that body position? And he was like here, and he was on rail. The whole thing was in the water.
Right.
And I'm like, how do I surf like that? It was basically what I was asking. And we had a back and forth, and he was like, why don't you just take out the fins on a board and just, go up, release, go up, release. And I was like, okay, that's going to make me ride the outline of the board more than the fins.
Right.
And that's always been a problem I've been working on in the last few years, is a lot of my turns, I can generate speed off the rail, but I can still say that I'm using the fins to generate speed, and it's also adding drag.
Right.
So I go out after it was like a head high plus day, and I couldn't go out without fins. Right. It was too good. I was like, I'm not gonna waste the session trying it without fins,
finless,
right? And so I was like, I'll just go smaller fins, and I grabbed my regular thruster set, and these are mediums, and I put these in.
Those are so much smaller.
So much smaller, right? And
but basically, you're
the
saying
same base, almost a little bit narrower base, just a smidge right here in the front.
Yeah.
But yeah, same uprightness, but smaller.
Right.
And the whole idea there was that, okay, if I don't put this thing on rail, it'll slip out.
Right.
And that'll be my negative cue that says I'm not using good technique.
Right.
Right. And that's, as soon as I did that, this thing started to roll right on and come up, roll right back, and it was completely unlocked. And if I didn't roll it on rail, it would slide on the bottom turn.
Right.
And so I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing it right, versus this I could cheat with. Right? And that's probably what I learned the most, was that when I used the big fins and it got a little bit stuck, remember I was saying like it would roll, but it would roll and I'd have to think about it.
Right.
I was probably relying on the fin instead of getting it on rail. And then if I did that same technique with this, the thing would slide.
Right.
Right. And so if I didn't, it would roll perfectly, hold, and then release out the top. It was awesome.
Interesting.
Felt great.
And then did you have a chance to ride version 2 with the thruster fins?
Yes. So I did, let me see, I think I did 4 sessions on this total, 2 with these, and then I went back to, no, I did 7. I did 7 with these, with the last 2 with these. And then on the last 3 sessions I rode that with this, and I felt the same thing. I felt the same thing, the good thing, that everything was loosened up.
That now you can get it on rail after you drop down.
Yeah, now I can get on rail. And that's why I'm looking at these two, and you're like, well, which one would you ultimately pick? And in terms of when the waves are bigger, they both felt exactly the same. But the smaller waves, I felt looser with this. And again, I don't know if maybe that was, I wasn't using good technique, and so I was sliding the fins out. And that's not what I should be doing. I'll have to maybe talk to Harry more about that. But I found it really interesting, because sometimes when I get boards, I want a board that challenges me to use good technique, in order for it to work right. And that's not always the case. I'm sure with many of your customers, it's like, no, just give me a board that works. Right. You don't want to be challenged.
But you should want to be challenged, but you want to be challenged on one dimension, right? Not 5 at the same time.
Yeah.
And so what you just said, I find really valuable and throughout the whole process, because the point is, all boards work, right? They're all planing surface. And, if you see Rob Machado ride an Alaya, you basically say, well, all you need to do is be a really good surfer. You can surf anything, right? So what happens is that you just have a reference point of like, this is what I surf. And so if you want a new board, then either you want to surf a different wave or a different way, or you want to change something about what you feel. So I always like to say, well, what is your point now? Where are you at? And then we just take that as a reference point. So I don't really fully believe that there are boards that just work. They all work.
Yeah.
But like, where are you coming from? What board are you on right now? And then let's get there. next.
Well, I think
right?
another dynamic was what waves you surf, right?
For sure.
I mean, I was very, in my mind, I was very specific about the types of waves I wanted to put these boards through.
Yeah.
The size, but also like the wave contour, the power band, all of that. So when I look at conditions, I can be like, because there were certain conditions where I was like, no, I wouldn't take that board.
Right.
I would take my high performance board, or I'd take my bigger board, right? So it fills that void in my quiver. And I think that's important for people when they talk to a shaper, is to really be more specific about the types of waves they want to surf the board in, which I think would be helpful for both sides. At least from the surfer side, it's helpful.
Right. It is. I haven't had, like I said, that much experience with people giving that detailed feedback, right?
But that might be a question that you need to start asking more. Of that.
I've started to ask mostly, what board are you on right now?
Okay.
And then we use that as a starting point, because not everybody surfs as varied spots as you do, because you go all over the world, right? You have that experience, whereas most people I talk to, they just surf every day, and they surf sort of around here, whether it's at OB or whether it's here down in Pacifica. And then it's much more about, what board are you on right now?
Yeah.
Because probably the new board, you're just going to ride at the same spot, right?
Right.
So then it's about like, you probably keep the wave constant, but like, what do we change about your board?
And that's if it's the same conditions, same kind of wave, same location. What do you want different between the board you have now and the one I'm about to shape for you?
Right.
And then I think just having people come to you and be like, yeah, I want something different than the board I ride, but then letting you know that, versus you're gonna then.
Well, and then what I then tend to ask is, well, first I need to know what board you're on right now, and then second I need to know, what are you looking to change?
Yeah.
Right. And so then there are always different options, right? Like,
so when someone answers that question, because this is, I think, will be helpful for people. Do you want an answer that's like, well, I want a pulled in board, I want a thinner board? Is that like not helpful to you, or is it more like what I provided, which was like, well, I'm having these issues with this board and these kinds of conditions, I want it to feel like this? Like what's more helpful for you?
I mean, at the end of the day, the most helpful thing is people who are willing to provide feedback. So I almost believe that, so I only have 3 customers who have been through this iteration with me, and you're the most articulate one. But that first board I make, that's a great starting point, but really even more valuable is like to then get feedback on that conversation, so I understand what people want to feel, right? For the first one I make, it's like, okay, let's understand where you are now. Tell me everything you want, right? And then if you tell me I want a more pulled in board, and that's at odds with all the other things that you say that you want from the new board, well, maybe we'll have a conversation about that, right?
Okay, that's perfect,
And then if you insist on having a pulled in board, well, I'll make you a pulled in board, but maybe it's not going to do what you want, right? Yeah.
So that's the other thing that I thought was really unique, and I said, this is the first time I've ever had this kind of like progression.
Right.
Where you gave me a board, it's like, okay, here's my demo board that kind of fits what you're looking for. Ride it, come back to me, tell me what you feel.
Right.
Right? And it was like, normally it's been, I'm going blank to a shaper, and I'm like, hey, I'm going on a surf trip, or I'm going to surf these kinds of waves, and this is how I want to surf it. And they shape me a board, and then, you know, I might provide them feedback afterwards, but there's never let me make you a second version of it.
Right.
And I find like that's a very unique thing that you're doing. And I don't know if you will continue to do this, but you'll have several demo boards that you could potentially do this and add a ton of value to that whole thing for local surfers. Right? Because I think it's valuable enough to pay more for that kind of service, because you end up with a board that fits your quiver or your need more than, you know, I had them ship me a board, cost me X amount, and then I might surf it once or twice a year because it didn't quite, it hit certain areas but not all of them. Versus now I'll take this board and I will surf it all the time. In the conditions I want to, because it's so refined. Does that make sense?
No, it totally makes sense. And sort of this experience has also made me think about whether, if you have the patience and the desire to like get a board that really works for you, whether you shouldn't be buying a board, but rather buy a program, if you will, right? Where you say like, oh, I'm going to get 3 boards, and I know I'm going to get 3 boards, and I know the first one is step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 3 is going to be perfect. And by that time, now I have I've built a relationship that I can tap into, right?
Right.
I haven't been selling boards long enough to understand if the market wants that.
Yeah.
But maybe that's a niche to go into.
It might be a niche, because I see, maybe I'm unique in this because I've been getting custom boards for a while. I think somebody that's new to buying custom boards, this would be super beneficial,
right?
More so than anything else, but I don't know if they know how to provide the right feedback to make changes.
And that's the second part that this inspired me to think is like, what would this process look like, the one that we've been doing, with a beginner surfer? Like somebody who has been surfing a year or two and is motivated and interested, but not as experienced. Could we replicate as happy of a journey?
Right.
I'd be very interested in that. So
yeah, we need to find some.
If some of your clients fit that bill, send them my way, and we'll figure something out, because it'd be highly instructive. Not only that, but I've been thinking that because you have so much experience and because you're very articulate, you have the words to describe this. But is there maybe a way to establish a vocabulary to put into people's heads before they even try? It's like, okay, here are the 5 things to pay attention to, and here are the sort of the way to describe what you're feeling, and then maybe people with less experience can then tap into that to sort of not only give feedback but also develop their own understanding of equipment and sort of.
So it's almost like a not a rubric, but like standard vocabulary, like you said, where you could even give them, here's a list of questions. It's multiple choice.
Right.
Did version 1 feel sticky? Did it feel, whatever the words are, right?
Right.
And they could check it off, or they can fill in the blank or whatever, and then they can start to establish that conversation with you.
Right.
Where it's that back and forth. That's a really interesting idea, because that educates the surfer, helps you get to that magic board sooner.
Right.
Because you're getting better feedback.
Right.
And it provides them with a way of talking about it without telling you what to do.
Right.
And I think that was the thing that, like I said, it was the most difficult part for me, because, with all the shapers, I'm always like, well, maybe I want a narrower board, but some of them I just like, hey, just shape me a board for barreling 8-foot waves,
right?
And they just do their thing because they know my height and weight. And that's all they need.
Right.
Like, okay.
Well, the interesting is somebody told me that the Australian shapers do pay attention to shoe size.
Shoe size.
Yes.
Okay.
So
interesting.
I've only heard California shapers ask about height and weight.
Yes.
But the thing you mentioned earlier, I mean, there's something to that, right? Like, where is your pressure point on the board should make a huge difference for how wide your board should be, right?
Right. And I've talked to Donald Brink about that too, because I was curious his thoughts on that. He's big on that as well. And my thought around it came from ladies' boards versus guys' boards. And because I come across some of my clients that have, when we talk about the width of a board, and then the ladies' shoulder widths are usually narrower, and yet they have guy shapers shaping them these wide boards. And I'm like, well, you're putting more strain on your rotator cuff by going wider, and so on and so forth. So find a lady shaper or somebody that understands that concept.
Right.
And that got me thinking, well, maybe there's something to the foot size and the pressure, because, Kelly, I think, has a pretty big foot. And you think about where their toe is. Yeah. If his toe's here and my toe's here. Yeah. Yeah, that right there, there's already a different leverage point. Right. Of just rolling just the back foot, let alone the front foot, where the width of the board is. Like, it's incredible. So yeah, I think that's an interesting one, and that's probably why I like the other reason why I think I like narrower boards is because I grew up with them. I grew up in the Kelly Slater potato chip narrow board era, and I'm used to that in my subconscious.
Now, on the flip side, some people also say just move your feet more.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't know what the right answer is, right? Somebody like Harry might say, well, just need to move your foot further to the rail.
Right.
Because that's been my experience when we talked about this earlier on a longboard. Right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to make it narrower than 23. I mean, I could, but I don't want to if I want to walk the board. And then
but that's different. Like, you're not rolling a board like you are trying to do. You're doing different performance on a long than on a short board. So,
but my point is that there's a functional width to every board.
Yeah.
And so if your feet aren't big enough, maybe you need to move them a little, right?
Yeah.
And so
that makes
then
sense.
the question is, where are you going to land, right?
Yeah.
Because like, if your feet are too small, I could say, well, great, I'm going to make you a 17-inch wide board. But that's just not going to float, right?
You got to be going really fast.
Right.
Yeah, no, definitely. And even in that same Rasta episode, he talked about on a fish, he moves his back foot over to the rail.
Oh.
And he's got big feet too.
Right.
But to really engage that rail, that he moves his whole foot over.
Right.
And so his heel's like here and his toes here.
Right.
Because normal fish is really wide.
Right.
And so that's how he described riding a twin fin more on rail versus skatey. Because I hear twin fin and I'm like, oh, it's a great skate. It's skatey.
Right.
Well, that's because I'm using the fins to turn.
Right.
I'm not rolling on rail, but that's the way I want to learn how to surf. So I've been doing it wrong. And then he describes this, and I was like, oh, that makes sense.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely a lot. And that was the other thing I struggled with, was how much of it was user error in my mind, because you're giving me more credit for my surfing skill level. Like I said, hearing Jesse, and Jesse can rip on that board, I'm like, oh, there's something wrong with me. And I was like, wait a minute. No. Everyone's unique in their own skill level and kind of their own path.
Right.
And so that's why I was like, okay, Jesse's on her own different path. I'm on this path. I'm going to give him feedback based on what I feel right now, based on the path that I'm on, and the things that I want to work on. So, yeah, I think for new surfers trying to get boards, or even intermediate surfers, that's important to keep it in consideration. Don't feel intimidated by your skill level versus what you're talking to the shaper about. Like, be real. Tell them what your skill level really is, and what are you most comfortable with in terms of size and power and shape of wave that you're surfing. Like, be honest. Don't be like macho, or don't be humble. Like, be fully honest.
Right.
And then say, this is what I actually want to do. Like, giving them a goal and be like, I want the board to feel this way. Because I think shapers can give a lot of insight into surfing better as well. And Clayton does that. Like, that's how Clayton got into coaching.
Right.
Like, he basically was like, the board's not shit, you're shit. And and then he's like got into coaching now. He's very blunt about it. But that's how he got into it. And I think shapers have that unique view. And especially for you, that's a local, the Pacifica wave. You're like, okay, someone comes to you that surfs Pacifica all the time. You can give so much feedback on what board is really going to work most days of the year. Right. There's going to be that golden day that, okay, maybe there's that one great board, but most days of the year you want a board that has these features.
Right.
So.
And the other thing about that kind of journey and that kind of feedback is that I feel you gave all of these boards a chance. Right? So in order to give feedback, you need to say, okay, this is a board, I'm going to try this board, I'm really going to lean into it, right? And what I sometimes hear other shapers say also is that they make good boards, they give them to surfers, and then those surfers don't spend enough time with the boards to actually want to, really understand what they're feeling, right? And especially for good surfers, it's so easy for them to just say, this is not working. Yeah. When maybe it could be working, but it's just not what they're used to, right? Yeah. Which comes back to what I said earlier. It's like, okay, what board are you riding right now? And all boards work. It's
Well,
just
and
what you want.
that's a different philosophy, because some coaches will even say if a board doesn't work right off the bat, it's a dud board. And I'm like, well, I think it had a lot to do. There's so many more variables than that. The conditions were huge.
Right.
But I had so much fun trying them.
And like, it's also a question like, how precious is your surf time?
Yes.
Right?
Okay. How precious are the waves too? Yeah.
Right.
Like I said, I'm not going to go out and ride with
Right.
no fins, but I'll.
But let me just
up.
give you an example of a difference where you say you can't just say this board doesn't work, because if you come from like a normal board, let's say, and somebody gives you like a Klaus Jones or some other hull, right, where if you don't ride it front-footed, you're just not going to make it work. If you try to turn it off your back foot too much, it's just not going to work.
Right.
Then somebody who only surfs normal boards will say, well, this board sucks.
Yeah.
But there are people who can surf those beautifully, right? So how much time are you going to spend, and like how much feedback are you going to give?
Yeah, and to your point about precious waves, like how much of your surf time are you going to give up? How many waves are you going to give up trying to figure something out?
Right.
And for me, it was a fun experiment, but also I had the opportunity. It was 7, 7, and 7, and I would say out of these, probably 10 or 12 of them were personal surfs where I felt, yeah, you know, if right off the bat it wasn't feeling right, I had another board in the car I could switch out. But it's, you know, they all felt, even that one felt good enough to just ride the whole session with it.
Right.
And then the other half, I had the benefit of being with clients where I catch a wave every once in a while and I could feel it out.
Right.
But you have to be willing to give up those waves, which my philosophy, as you know, is always like make your strokes precious and your waves more wasteful if you want to progress. Right? Like, but the mindset is so like, oh, I finally got a good wave.
Right.
I'm gonna go straight and not do a thing. Like, you're not gonna progress that way.
Right.
And when I just said this yesterday to a level 2 client I was with. I said, look at our session, because we were talking about different conditions and where to sit and, you know, what strategy to use to get the most waves given, and the most waves, not just the most waves, but the most waves that would benefit him in his surfing. And for him in his surfing, it was takeoff, bottom turn, set a line. It wasn't even bottom turn, top turn. It was just take off, bottom turn, set a line, go down a little bit. And that would be a great rep. And I was like, when we look at our whole session, how many of the waves that we saw come through were perfect for that? That's how you build your strategy of where you're going to sit and what waves you're going to take off on. Is whatever you're working on, you know, a 50-second point break wave would have been nice. It would have fulfilled his goal, but he wouldn't need that necessarily. It's almost overkill. It's almost over-spec'd. But a straight closeout was not good enough for that need. Does that make sense? So like somebody that's just working on their takeoff, a closeout's perfect. You can get a lot of reps with closeouts. And so when you look at your session, and a lot of my sessions were, I want to work on takeoff, bottom turn, top turn, and that was pretty much it.
Right.
And with these boards, that's what I looked for. And so for me, and this might be beneficial for people testing boards, is to have that goal in mind of the type of wave and the type of maneuvers you want to try the board out on, and then go for waves that do that instead of sitting out the back waiting for the most perfect wave ever.
Right.
And then not doing anything on it, and then being like, yeah, the board sucks.
Right.
It's like, no. You got to give it reps in order to progress and to figure it out. So I was really happy to do it, but maybe I'm weird like that too. Like I don't mind falling, I don't mind blowing waves.
Well, that
in the sake of learning.
plus you have a very methodical mindset, right? You're a scientist at heart.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there.
Test it out.
Test it out. Yeah. So to come back to the verdict, it sounds to me, and you are going to play it back to me if I'm right, that because of your fin choice, you actually like the board with more concave, so version 2, better than version 3. Because in small wave, it works better because you have more lift. But in bigger waves, they're the same. When you take the small fins.
Smallest fin done, yeah. And what you said today was very surprising to me. That's epoxy and that's PU. And I wouldn't have thought that.
Why?
Because this, in my mind, epoxy floats more.
Oh, right.
PU sinks more.
Oh,
when you're going faster.
Yeah.
Just going faster, they felt the same.
Just to be clear, all of these are just normal foam. So none of this is EPS.
Okay.
So this is just, standard foam,
Yeah.
epoxy, and polyester resin.
Okay.
Yeah. Usually when you say
resin,
it's an
okay.
epoxy board, you say it's EPS foam.
This is education, right? So it's the foam.
Oh, you didn't know that?
No, I didn't. No.
No, the foam is all the
Foam's
same.
all the same. Okay.
And so the weight will be the same. They say that the flex of the polyester resin is a little bit more giving than the epoxy. But really, if the reason why epoxies are lighter and more floaty, it's actually the foam.
That's what I thought. Yeah. So so the foam's all the same.
The foam's
right.
all
So
the
now that makes sense
Right.
to me. That makes much more
Right.
sense. Yeah. So yeah, I do like the more concave with the smaller fin.
Right.
Which I had heard people say when you're in bigger waves, you don't need as much fin. And this was actually I was playing with this experiment with a different board. Bigger waves, I was putting, I have smalls that I put in my high performance big wave board. And I was filling it out and I was like, okay, I could see it, but it was sliding out too much. And I was like, okay, I need to make sure I make this wave or else I get obliterated.
Right.
This was the first time I actually really felt the difference between big, small, and keel.
Right.
And I'm completely biased against the keel. I hate keels. I don't know why.
Keels. Okay.
I think it's because I don't know how to ride on rail yet. And I think as soon as I clean that up more consistently, I'll like the longer arc turn with the keel. But that's my opinion or my thought. But yeah, the fins actually made a huge difference. So listen, you have to listen to your shaper about fins. Like, because on this one, you said change the fin. Totally different board. On this one,
well, on the second one, I thought we had found the fins because we went from like a super wide base, like super keely fin to the uprights. And we're like, okay, those are the fins for you.
Yeah.
What turns out, they're not.
Well,
the
they are in
smaller
small
ones.
waves. Yeah, they were perfect in small waves.
Right.
And then Harry unlocked that last point where it was just by happenstance that I put the smaller fin in instead of no fins. And I was like, oh, there it is.
There it is.
Because I was nervous. I was like, ah, crap. I gotta tell Zouhair that it's not working. Like, I'm like, damn it, we need a big version for it. And then we put it in. I was like, ah. It was awesome.
But funny enough, that insight made you go from version 3 back to version 2, and that's your keeper.
Yeah.
Sounds like.
Yeah. But and then again, that's just because of the smaller wave, the smaller wave performance. Which again, the differences you said were concave all the way through with a little bit less concave to flat.
Yeah.
Right. And so maybe that was the difference in small waves. Yeah. Because of the lift. Yeah, makes total sense. I love it. But yeah, it was really fun. And thank you for the year of back and forth.
Great.
I felt bad at how long it took, but we needed the same waves.
We need the same waves.
To test it. And that's, again, why I think wave pools are great for this. Because you can get through this a lot quicker. You could probably get through all this in one trip.
Right.
Because you could it's almost like you have to limit yourself to how many changes you make.
Right. Also, you have to limit
you have
yourself
to have three pre-boards ready to go.
And you have to limit yourself how many waves you're going to take per wave pool session on one board. Otherwise, you have too much fun and you can forget about
but
the
I
testing.
mean, like Waco, it's 10 to 12 in a public session, 10 to 12 maybe, or 8 to 12 in a public, and a little bit more in a private.
Yeah.
And you could do 1, 1, 1. And if you had 3 demo boards, I think by the third version you'd be like, I know exactly the kind of board to shape for you.
Right.
But then again, the problem with the wave pool then is you're now on like this perfect wave where you don't have to wander around.
Right.
It's like, I honestly surf high performance boards and wave pools now with very little volume, very little length, because you don't need all that. Once you're planing, you're just surfing.
It's good to go.
Yeah, so there's that side of it. That's a problem. But still be fun to try. But yeah.
Well, this was good.
Yeah.
Now we need to figure out what we do in 2025.
Rocker experiment. So that should be fun. Or volume versus length again. Do you have any other ideas?
Well, that's
for paddling.
Oh, for paddling.
Tail doesn't matter.
Well, for paddling, so there's two different things. So you coach two levels. The first one is, what is the endurance paddle, the 90% of the time paddle? And the second one is, what's wave catching? And so we did that first experiment, and we just figured out length. Length is the major factor in sort of how easy it is to cover distance, right? So longer boards, better for that. Awesome. I'd be interested to really follow that up with rocker, because the common wisdom and perception is more rocker is going to make you paddle worse.
Right, slower.
But
would it? Nose rocker.
Nose rocker.
Yeah.
But if you think about like the amount of frontal drag that presents on, let's say, a 7.6, let's just do 7.6. That's a nice gliding length for, you know, the experiments we've been doing.
Yeah.
If I vary the rocker from like 4 to 4.5 to 5 inch, how much more frontal drag is there really? I would want to see the data in your pool, in your wave pool, in your sort of endless pool, to see, right?
I'd like to see the average speed, is the top speed in the lagoon too, because we did that with the other ones too.
Right.
I don't think there's gonna be much. I think it'll be negligible.
My hunch is the same.
Yeah.
That rocker actually isn't that much of a problem for that type of paddling. But I'd also be interested, and I don't know how to test for that. We observed it in the ocean testing with the first experiment set of boards, that you still have a higher wave count on the smaller high volume board.
Yeah, but was that a reflection of the conditions that we surfed that day? I'm not sure.
I mean,
because you could sit inside more, you weren't waiting for the
qualitative feedback was not just, also your reaction time is just so much lower. So then the question with all the paddling stuff is, well, what's more important right now? You know, saving energy on the 90% of the time that you're paddling, or increasing wave count?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And does any of that matter?
And then going back to rocker, not to jump around, but with the rocker, with wave catching, it's the steepness of the wave, but also how quickly does that rocker provide lift, so you feel like you're going to planing faster in the approach to catching a wave. I don't know how to measure that consistently.
I wouldn't know. I don't have a good hunch on that either, especially because if you see good surfers, depending on how the wave pitches, you will see that their upper body angles differently. And so, as you know, you've done videos about this, what they do is they change the angle of attack of the board based on how they move their upper body. So what can the shaper do about that? Nothing, because the rocker's there, and the surfer's actually managing that rocker in the wave. So would it make a difference?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know, right?
I think of the early 90s boards, my one that I use for my signage, the Aero board.
The
thing is super rockered out. It's like a full banana in the front, and that's what the style back in the day was. Late drop, super concave wave, and you're just fitting it in, and just having that extra rocker helps you not nosedive. But now you look at boards today, there's almost no rocker compared to that. They're getting in just as easy. To your point, they've adjusted. So yeah, it's that one's so much harder because there's more variables. You need like a robotic surfer that does the same technique every time in the same wave. Yeah, that would be tough. But we could do the paddling one. And at least
that's the easiest one to test.
Yeah.
And then maybe we can just debunk the whole rocker doesn't paddle thing. And that's worth something too, right?
Yeah, totally. Okay, cool. We got a plan.
Awesome.
Well, thanks, man. Appreciate
Thank you. Yeah, this was fun.